Class is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar on Music and Ofsted's Education Inspection Framework delivered by the ISM Trust. I'm Naomi Bath, Senior Research and Policy Officer here at the ISM. Before we begin, a few technical points. You can't see me, but you should be able to see the PowerPoint presentation. You should also be able to hear me, but I can't hear you. So if you have any questions, please type them in the questions box and I'll answer as many as possible at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to view on the ISM's website at ism.org/webinars. The content of this presentation is for information purposes only. It is not intended to be a substitute for other professional advice and should not be relied upon as such. You can contact us about your specific situation, and if you require legal advice, ISM members can contact the ISM legal team. I hope you'll find the information helpful. It will be available on our website at ism.org and also ismtrust.org shortly after this webinar. So in terms of what is going to be covered in the webinar today, I'm going to explain what I think are the main issues relating to music education in Ofsted's new inspection framework. I'm sure the issues I cover won't be exhaustive, so please do make a note of further or additional points that you'd like to discuss at the end. I should also say that this webinar isn't designed to talk through the process of an Ofsted inspection. It's just to look at those particular aspects of the new framework that will affect music education. Before we begin looking at the inspection framework, it might be a good idea to give you a little context for how the new framework came about. So in January this year, Ofsted published draft proposals of the inspection framework, handbook, and research summary in order to launch its consultation. Stakeholders had nearly 3 months to review these documents and respond, with the consultation closing in April. The ISM submitted a detailed response on behalf of members and led the response on behalf of the Back for the Future campaign. Ofsted received around 15,000 responses to their consultation, their largest ever, and 5 weeks later published the finalised framework. The new inspection framework was officially implemented on the 1st of September, so this is the first week it's been in force. The first thing we're going to look at are the 4 key judgments. So as you can see on the slide, Ofsted has removed the outcomes judgment, which has historically been very data-driven, and they have also replaced the teaching, learning and assessment judgment. This is a positive step by Ofsted because it reflects their efforts to discourage schools from having narrow and restricted curricula and from teaching to the test, which we know is driven by high-stakes accountability measures. Ofsted's own research confirmed the mounting evidence of curriculum narrowing, so they have responded by placing a broad and balanced curriculum at the heart of their new inspection framework. A school's curriculum will now be assessed through a new quality of education judgment, which looks at the intent, implementation and impact of the curriculum. I will mostly be looking at the quality of education judgment today, but should probably mention that music is relevant to the personal development judgment through references to cultural education that you'll find in the Ofsted handbook. Before we get on to the nuts and bolts of the quality of education judgment, it's important to say that Ofsted's new approach to a broad and balanced curriculum applies to academies just as much as maintained schools, which is potentially encouraging for music education. We know from research that music education is quite variable in academies because they don't have to follow the national curriculum. We also know that this affects a large proportion of schools. 72% of secondary schools and 27% of primary schools were academies or free schools, according to data from last year. It is therefore encouraging to see that Ofsted requires a broad and balanced curriculum from all state-funded schools, including academies. As you can see from the quote on the slide, academies must offer a curriculum that is of similar breadth and ambition as the national curriculum. So our hope and expectation is that inspectors will look for music education and other creative subjects in academies. So the quality of education judgment scrutinises the intent, implementation and impact of the curriculum. Now, there's been a lot of discussion among teachers and educators about how they demonstrate curriculum intent and whether they need to write new statements to prove they are doing it. Ofsted has categorically said that this is not the case and has described it as a myth. They have also said that intent is simply about what school leaders think pupils should learn. Ofsted has also recognised that time is required to develop and embed an effective curriculum. So if school leaders are only partway through the process of redeveloping a curriculum, that will not negatively affect the outcome of a school's inspection. So if we take a closer look at what Ofsted has said they're looking for in terms of curriculum, we can see there are some areas for concern regarding music. A major area of concern for music educators is the inclusion of the EBAC in the framework. The ISM did raise this issue in our consultation response, and Ofsted themselves have admitted that it was a commonly raised concern during the consultation period, but they have unfortunately retained the reference to the EBAC in their finalised framework. So in the framework, Ofsted states that inspectors need to understand what schools are doing to prepare for the government targets of EBAC uptake. So to explain a little bit more about the EBAC, it is the government's national ambition that 75% of Year 10 pupils in state-funded schools should be studying EBAC GCSE courses by 2022, rising to 90% by 2025. But we know that the current figure of EBAC uptake is around 38%, so schools will really be feeling the pressure to focus on EBAC subjects. And I'm sure it hardly needs mentioning, but as the EBAC excludes creative, artistic and technical subjects from counting in school league tables, it damages the uptake of these subjects. So it really is disappointing that inspectors will take schools' preparations for the EBAC into account. At the ISM, we do not believe that the EBAC is conducive to a broad and balanced curriculum. However, there is one slightly reassuring piece of news from the framework, that inspectors won't make a judgment about the quality of education based solely or primarily on its progress towards the EBAC ambition. So it will play a role in the judgment, but it won't be the only thing that inspectors take into account. There is another slightly odd aspect relating to when and where the requirement for a broad and balanced curriculum seems to apply. For example, it appears that the curriculum at Key Stage 1 does not need to be broad and balanced. When we look at the description of Key Stage 1 in the Ofsted handbook, and this is quoted on the slide, it states that inspectors need to, quote, check that pupils are able to read, write and use mathematical knowledge, ideas and operations so that they are able to access a broad and balanced curriculum at Key Stage 2, end quote. The implication here is that Key Stage 1 should consist of the building blocks to read and write in order to access a broad and balanced curriculum at Key Stage 2, but we would disagree with that. Key Stage 1, as well as early years, should absolutely be broad and balanced too. In terms of Key Stage 3, Ofsted's comments are more encouraging in that they are addressing the widespread practice of schools shortening Key Stage 3 down to 2 years to allow for an extra year studying the GCSE syllabus. As you can see from the quote on the slide, Ofsted will be paying particular attention to any shortening of Key Stage 3, which would curtail a broad and balanced curriculum too soon. There was an interesting decision by Ofsted to include a reference to cultural capital in the inspection framework for the first time. At first glance, it appears to be a good thing, a signal that Ofsted recognises the importance of culture and indeed music. However, there's recently been increasing criticism among educators about the definition of cultural capital used by Ofsted and what it signifies. The criticism centres around Ofsted's definition of cultural capital, which is restricted to the essential knowledge that children need to be educated citizens, which quotes a section of the national curriculum. A Guardian article published earlier this week cites several academics who criticise the definition, saying it misunderstands the concept, which was originally coined by French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, saying that it is reductionist, elitist and naive. So if you are thinking about the concept of cultural capital and how you might apply it in your school, I would encourage you to read around the topic. For example, the Guardian article, and also a recent blog by the Cultural Learning Alliance. There are links on this slide. The ISM is also likely to produce a resource on this issue, like a blog or a webinar, so please check our website in due course if you are interested. So moving away from the specifics of the quality of education judgment now, it is worth saying that the 4-point grading scale for schools remains the same. Your outstanding, good, requires improvement, and inadequate. From a music point of view, it is unfortunately still the case that schools can be awarded an outstanding rating, even if they don't have a high quality music offer. We think this contradicts Ofsted's commitment to a truly broad and balanced curriculum. Another point on outstanding ratings that isn't yet in the framework but is interesting is that the existing exemption for schools rated outstanding to be inspected again will be scrapped from next September. This is 2020. This will address the issue of schools once rated outstanding going for years without an inspection and therefore not being scrutinised. A very quick final point to make is that there seems to be no sign that a lead HMI for each art subject will be reinstated. There hasn't been a subject lead in music since 2015, which is rather troubling given that it is such an important subject and it needs inspecting and evaluating by experts. So drawing this presentation to a close, it is always helpful and reassuring to remember that music education is vitally important, and not just to you as music educators or to us at the ISM. In the most recent parent survey undertaken by Ofsted, only 32% of parents stated that they thought music was covered enough in schools. That means that 68% of parents didn't think their children were experiencing enough music education. Hopefully Ofsted will listen to the results of their own survey and factor music more strongly into their inspections. So if your school is inspected in the coming weeks and months, the ISM would be very interested to hear your experiences, given that there is a new framework in force. Please do share your experiences with me by emailing the address on the next slide.
Thank you very much, Naomi, for the presentation, and thank you very much all for listening. We have some spare time now for some questions, so if you do have any questions in mind, please write them in the question box and we'll try and answer them. If, however, you think of a question after the presentation has finished, you can either send them to Naomi at the email address that's on the slide, or you can send them to us at the ISM membership at ism.org and we'll pass it on. So as I mentioned earlier, if you do have any questions, we are ready for them. Well, we seem to be all right in terms of questions. No one seems to have any. Oh, there we go. That's the first question. Thank you very much.
So the question I can see on our screen is, what does HMI stand for? And it's Her Majesty's Inspector. So it's just the official name for an Ofsted inspector. And I've spotted another one, which is, have they given any advice on their deep dive into music? I'm aware that there have been all sorts of pilot deep dives over the past sort of 6 to 9 months as part of the inspection testing. Personally, I'm not aware of any into music specifically, but that doesn't mean there haven't been any. If you're aware of them, please do share. It'd be very interesting to see what they have experienced in schools. I did hear one thing recently about the possibility that if an inspector goes into a school where music provision is provided only by the hub, then it would be difficult if they came on one specific day and that wasn't the day that the music teacher was visiting. They wouldn't therefore be able to inspect music. So it speaks to how extensive the provision is, whether it's just parachuted in for one day, but that's just sort of one thing I've heard. I couldn't speak with much authority about that. The same person that asked about the deep dive said there's one in the Luton area, so I will definitely look into that. Thank you very much. And now I've just spotted another one. Will inspectors be interested in assessing for mastery in music and greater depth at each key stage? That's a very interesting question. I'm not sure exactly whether they're going to chart the progress and continuity at each key stage. I think it's encouraging that they're looking at this broader curriculum and that they'll be looking at music in the first place, hopefully, so that it hasn't slipped off the radar. I would hope that they'll be looking for greater depth and progress, especially by the time we get to Key Stage 3 and ensuring that Key Stage 3 lasts for those 3 years. So I would hope so, but I would hope they'd be interested, but I sort of can't confirm it, not being an inspector myself. Okay, I've just spotted another one. Has Ofsted mentioned what they mean about an ambitious curriculum? Well, I think there's a couple of things on that point. One, they've really strongly defined a curriculum as broad and balanced, and I expect that would be what they mean by ambitious. But the one thing that springs to mind is in their description of the EBAC, and how in the draft handbook it was described as a target and a requirement, and in the revised framework it was described as an ambition for schools. So they sort of toned their language down a bit, possibly reacting to the responses to the consultation. So those are my sort of thoughts on ambition and the curriculum. I think those are the questions for now. Just see if any more pop in. There's a question about, does the ISM have any thoughts on a music curriculum statement? I'm not sure exactly what that means, about whether the ISM has put out a statement on music curriculum. I know that the ISM Trust has these great resources by Dr. Ali Daubney and Professor Martin Faultley, all about the national curriculum and how to use that at Key Stage 1, 2, and then Key Stage 3, the separate documents that are available for members, which are brilliant. So in that sense, that's sort of statement on the music curriculum. So I hope that sort of answers that one. And we've got one about how much notice I think schools get before a deep dive. I'm not sure. I think it's actually I don't want to say in case I get it wrong. So I can always check that before I make a mistake on that one. Just see if there's any others.
Okay, well, thank you for your questions so far. As I mentioned previously, if you do think of any further questions afterwards, you can either send them straight to Naomi or to us at the ISM membership email address. And we hope you enjoyed today's webinar, and we hope to see you at another one soon.